slowly until I introduce Professor Ioannidis. Hopefully some more people will join. So most of you are familiar with the legacy of Professor Ioannidis, but I will say a few words. Professor Ioannidis is currently a professor in Stanford University, after having served in several universities in Greece, also in the UK and US. He's a recipient of various awards, and he's very well known for his influential research in a variety of areas across epidemiology. And he's also very well known about some of his most provocative writings, starting from the early Arabian Nights, that was on pharmaceutical funding of medical conferences in order to increase medical subscription, coming up to the PLS medicine paper on why most published research findings are false, that currently has more than 3 million hits. Also, last but not least, in my view, he's the author of 9 literary books. And during his visit in Athens, as he's just informed me, he will also be presenting 2 of his newest literary books in a central bookshop in Athens. He's one of the highest rated researchers with an H index more than 230. So it's our pleasure to welcome Professor Ioannidis today to the stand to talk to us about reproducible science for knowledge and decision making. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for this very kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to join you for the conference. I arrived around 1 after midnight from California, and it's about 11 p.m. For me, California time. And this morning, the traffic was so horrible that I thought that it would take longer than coming from San Francisco to Athens, but I'm here nevertheless. So, reproducible science. Some disclosures: I have no conflicts of interest other than being tremendously biased because I study bias. Some preemptive comments: science is the best thing that can happen to humans. It can offer knowledge in the form of evidence with various degrees of uncertainty. Decision-making should use the best evidence, acknowledging properly the certainty and uncertainty. Scientific research needs to be supported with heightened commitments, especially important research, like the type of research that you're doing. Most research done today, unfortunately, has not been transparent, and much of it has not been reproducible. And I think that reproducible science, this is what I'm trying to convince you during this keynote, is needed to accomplish the mission of science. Science is very successful. Perhaps it's too successful sometimes. We have 35 million authors publishing. If you go to Scopus, there's more than 35 million authors that have published at least 1 scientific paper. More than 7 million scientists have published at least 5 scientific papers. Close to 200 million scholarly documents, increasing at a rate of 5+ million per year. And then each paper, especially papers in epidemiology, are classics in that regard, may have up to millions of results. Results that are maybe presented in supplements, sometimes not even in supplements. Some of the data that we are collecting are extremely multifarious. Translation takes a long time. This is looking at the creme de la creme papers of the most highly cited articles published in medicine. The milestones are with the red dots, and I'm showing you how long it took to reach that milestone, which is a large randomized trial on a clinical or public health milestone achievement. On average, 30 years, sometimes 200 years, like for example in the case of nitric oxide from the original discovery. And about 40% of these creme de la creme were refuted by larger, better controlled, better done studies within just a few years, and others are still floating around. How can we make the process more efficient? How can we make it better for us, for public health, for science, and for community at large? We seek reproducibility. Well, everyone is seeking reproducibility. This is some text mining information that we got looking at all 25 major fields of science. They are all talking more about reproducibility, for example, reproducibility of results, but people think of very different aspects of what that means. Basically, they think along 3 axes: reproducibility of methods, reproducibility of results, and reproducibility of inferences. Reproducibility of methods is the ability to understand what has happened in a scientific project, in a scientific paper. I want to read this fine print in the method section, and maybe the supplements, and be able to make it to work in my own hands, in my own lab, in my own laptop, in my own desktop, in my own supercomputer, in my own environment, make it work. So I need, ideally, a good description of what has happened and some code that also functions. Reproducibility of results means that I'm running one other study, and I try to see whether that study corroborates, agrees, squares with the previous study that I have done. And in epidemiology, we're very familiar with that, but obviously we're also familiar with the concept of heterogeneity in the results and the concept of how much heterogeneity is too much or is acceptable to say that, well, we do see the same signal again. And then reproducibility of inferences means that I have 2 or 3 or 10 or 100 or 5,000 studies, and I have 1,000 people, or I heard there's 1,500 people or more attending the conference in person or virtually. And I ask them, what do you make of this? And not everyone will agree that this means exactly the same thing, and this means the same translation into action, into policy, to something that needs to be done. There's problems in that process that arise both at the level of methods and results and inferences. One classic cluster of problems is small data. Many studies that we do in epidemiology and in other fields are small sample studies. This may be unavoidable in some situations because we have lots of very smart people and very limited funding. So unavoidably, you have teams that are struggling to get the most with the very limited funds that they have the prototype of the principal investigator who's fighting against everyone else, solo, siloed, needs to get funding against competition, needs to convince that there's something important coming out of his team or his lab. So showing the best looking results is very common. Much of that is happening post hoc with the best intentions, not fraud that I'm talking about. Many fields, both in epidemiology and in other fields, use very lenient statistical rules. P-value of less than 0.05 is enough. There's no registration. There's no data sharing in many fields because it's thought that this is giving ammunition to these competitors that may compete for the same funds, and no replication. People move on to the next target. Then the other recipe, which is also becoming increasingly common, is what we see with big data. In many fields, both in epidemiology and beyond, and I think environmental epidemiology has seen that boom of big data with huge databases, with extremely large sample sizes, which means that they're very well-powered. Actually, they're overpowered to show everything as statistically significant, especially if we go with a lenient p-value of 0.049. Again, one needs to build a narrative, select the best-looking results to fit that narrative. Much of that is still done post hoc. There's more statistical fancy in many of these analyses, but they tend to be more idiosyncratic. So you have methods that occupy one subfield and another subfield that may be doing similar work, may be using different statistical methods. So there's some problem with communication sometimes. Most of that research, again, is not registered. And there's more data sharing. Many of these data sets actually are available for wider communities to use, but some of them are not very well organized. So there's less understanding of what exactly is being shared. For example, the code book and even more so, the details of how exactly the data have been accumulated may be missing. So big data is fascinating, and I think that in their interface with public health, they can give us amazing power to look at very interesting questions and hypotheses and validate and act based on them. At the same time, we have to watch out for big noise and big error. Empirical studies on multiple fields, both in epidemiology and in other scientific disciplines, where replication practices have become more common, suggest that most of the initial claimed statistically significant effects are either false positives or substantially exaggerated. We have seen that in many fields like genetics, genome-wide associations, for example, where a complete change of the landscape compared to candidate gene genetics, where we're chasing one or a few genes at a time for one or a few phenotypes. When we try to replicate in the agnostic framework the findings of candidate gene studies, only 1.2% of them have survived. Other fields have gone through a complete type of soul searching. For example, psychological science published that paper in Science 2015 with 271 authors and their labs. The paper was published in Science, and they looked at 100 high-profile papers that that psychologists had published in the creme de la creme journals of their discipline, and they tried to reproduce what had been published. About a third of them could be reproduced, and the effect sizes, even when reproduced, were substantially smaller compared to the original claims. What about if you just read Nature and Science? A similar type of exercise here suggests that about 50% of the studies could be reproduced and about 50% of the effects could survive. How about predicting what will survive and what will not? Not so good. These are prediction markets that my colleagues Anna Dreber and others, Tom Pfeiffer, have put forth in the last several years, trying to see whether by asking experts and by also giving them incentives to play, like in the stock exchange, put their money on what they think will be reproduced and withhold their money from what they think will not be reproduced, whether they can do better than chance or better than just telling them, what do you think? They do a little better, so maybe they're correct about 60 to 70% of the time in some fields, but still, it's very difficult when we see a new hypothesis and some new data coming forth to say that this is going to be correct or this is something that may not stand the test of time. This leads to reproducibility wars, which means that some people are not happy to see things that are not reproduced. I love to see my work not being reproduced because it supports my main hypothesis that most research is not reproducible. But most other people would hate this. And I think that it's completely normal to try to fight for what I have published, for what you have published, for what anyone has published, with arguments, with data, with evidence. And sometimes there's a feeling that if a signal is not reproduced, maybe the scientist is not a good one. Maybe there's even fraud. Maybe there's something completely wrong and that person needs to go to jail. No, but even worse, there's a psychological substratum here, and that leads to the reproducibility wars about what exactly is successful, what is unsuccessful, and what is uninterpretable. There's also a lot of resistance to refutation, meaning that both my team and other teams have looked at what happens when we have multiple very well studies contradict some original observations. For example, beta-carotene being the most effective chemopreventive agent for cancer. A major paper in Nature, 1980, thousands of citations, multiple studies including six very large randomized trials not showing really any benefit. But that paper continues to be very heavily cited, and actually the vast majority of these citations are very favorable for beta-carotene as chemoprevention for cancer. Very few, close to none, cite the 6 large randomized trials that showed that it had no benefit. In many cases, we see diminishing effects. So it's not that the effect goes away completely, but it shrinks substantially. For example, in that empirical evaluation, we looked at the most highly cited biomarker studies in the biomedical literature, and I'm showing you here the relative risk in the highly cited study and the relative risk in the largest study. Almost all of the action is below the diagonal, which suggests that the largest study, which may not necessarily be the best, but perhaps it tends to be a little bit more reliable, tends to have much smaller effect size estimates compared to the highly cited study that has driven the field, sometimes with thousands and thousands of papers on these biomarkers. Are there biases that are pervasive and you can see them in every scientific field? Well, we tried to answer that question, a very ambitious question, along with Dan Fanelli and Rodrigo Costas, using data from more than 3,000 meta-analyses and more than 200,000 studies in very different scientific fields. We pre-postulated 18 types of biases that may be manifest, not proven, but giving hints of their existence through the patterns of results that you would see in meta-analysis. And most fields had most hints of most biases, but there were differences. So, for example, small study effects, which means that small studies tend to give more exaggerated estimates compared to large studies, were pretty prominent in social sciences. They were substantial on average, but with substantial heterogeneity across subfields in the biomedical sciences, and they were absent in the physical sciences. You know, physical sciences, they have these big telescopes and they can have all the data that they want, so it's not so much of an issue of small studies. Gray literature bias, decline effects, early extreme citation bias, US-specific country bias, all of these were seen to different amounts in different scientific fields. So each field needs to decide what are the potential biases that may be more threatening for us and how could we deal with them. In epidemiology, one of the landmark papers has been the Bradford Hill criteria, which Austin Bradford Hill did not really call criteria, but we try to think along the lines of strength, consistency, specificity, temporality, biological gradient, plausibility, coherence, experiment, and analogy. At the 50-year celebration, I gave a lecture, which I then published in Statistics and Medicine, trying to think, where do we stand with these 9 features, which Bradford Hill said that none of them is perfect. There are just some things to consider. I concluded that most of them do not work. Some of them work sometimes. A few of them may actually be in the opposite direction. And I don't want to generalize that because I think that it may vary from one field to another. In some fields, they may work much better compared to others. This is one example of trying to apply these criteria and some evidence on air pollution as cause of mental disease. And again, strength, consistency, specificity, temporality, biological gradient, plausibility, coherence, experiment, and analogy. No experimental data, of course. We're not going to pollute someone in a randomized trial. So we're stuck with the others. We can say a little bit about temporality. We can hopefully hope for consistency. Strength, and unfortunately, most of the associations that we're chasing have small effect sizes, but they could be of tremendous importance at the public health level. So an odds ratio relative risk of 1.15 could translate to millions of people dying. So that's not a reason to dismiss it, to say that we have low credibility. We have to live with that. It is what it is. And then all the others. How about some other criteria? This is another set of criteria that my team has proposed, trying to look at some main features of the evidence. Number 1, amount. Number 2, statistical support. Number 3, amount of heterogeneity, consistency in the Bradford Hill language. What happens with large studies? Do they show some effect? And how about hints of bias? For example, hints of selective reporting, which are biases not at the level of the single study, but at the level of how the field operates, how the meta-epidemiology of the field might be operating. For example, is it in favor of significant results or against? Sometimes a field may be against significant results. Many fields that, for example, are sponsored by pharma and are looking at harms. The bias is not for significant results. The bias is against significant results, trying to show that there's no problem with the medication and everyone should take it. We know very well in epidemiology that if you have a lot of data, you can run a lot of analysis. And if we have a lot of covariates, this means that we can run analysis in many different ways. This is what I call vibration of effects, which at the extreme version becomes what I call the Janus phenomenon, from the Greek-Roman god who could see in 2 opposite directions. These are data from the National Household Survey in the US, and if you think of covariates to include in an analysis of mortality, having mortality as the outcome, you can decide to include or not include each one of these covariates. If you decide on 19 such covariates, you have 2 to the 19th power, you have 1 million plus different models, different regression models that you can run. So this is what I'm running for you here, along with Chirag Patel and Belinda Burford. And we see that, for example, for alpha tocopherol as a risk factor for mortality, about 70% of the analysis suggests that it decreases mortality risk, about 30% of the analysis suggests that it increases mortality risk. And some of the results are highly significant, others are non-significant, others are borderline significant. So unless I have some way to sort that out, I can really present any result that I wish in a very wide space. Many of the environmental exposures also, we have very solid evidence that are highly correlated. This is a correlation globe based on the Singapore health cohort, and I'm showing you 20 non-genetic exposures. I believe that these are nutrients, for example. If you see a link between 2, it means that there is a substantial correlation. Practically everything is correlated with everything. We can see similar patterns also in many pollutants and many environmental exposures. Many of them tend to create clusters of fairly densely correlated exposures. This is a correlation globe for triglyceride levels, and it includes both environmental, pesticides, heavy metals, dietary factors. Again, a very dense correlation globe, which some of those may be causal and others may be just innocent bystanders. How do we synthesize that information? Meta-analysis comes to the rescue, but actually it may make things worse. Over the years, I have been a very strong proponent of meta-analysis, but also a strong critic of meta-analysis, because I have seen so many meta-analyses that are horrible that I'm not sure that I have seen any other design being so horrible. And I want to take that blame, because I have supported that effort. And this is from a paper that I published a number of years ago, saying that we have practically a pandemic of problematic meta-analysis rising at an exponential pace. And if you look at how many of them could be reliable, you end up with a very small proportion. Some of them remain unpublished, many of them are redundant and unnecessary. Some are decent, but not looking at useful questions, either from clinical or public health perspective. Some are looking at data that are really obsolete, like candidate gene genetics. Many are just flawed beyond repair, and in my estimate, there's about 3% of them that are both decent and clinically or public health related useful. This is a paper that I did looking at meta-analysis on environmental and occupational health specifically. At the time that I did the search 5 years ago, there were 1,251 meta-analyses. The number has grown substantially since then. Looking at a single year, for example, 2015, notable were the preponderance of such papers from China, which has continued to rise very prominently. It had overtaken the US and European countries even then. Only a small minority having individual level data, but some did, which is very welcome compared to other fields that almost nothing has individual level data. I think environmental occupational health has wonderful examples of consortia and collaborations that are in the interface between consortium and meta-analysis that I believe are far more reliable than just looking at what data have been published in the past. And another good sign is that only one had an industry author, someone who has looked into conflicts of interest related to the industry in the past. I'm very happy to see that. Actually, none also had listed authors from consultancy firms, which seems to be a major problem in meta-analysis from other fields. Still, these meta-analyses, they were not conclusive in many situations as one might wish. For example, if you take mobile phones and cancer, which has been one of the most debated and controversial issues, I found 12 meta-analyses by that time. There's many more by now. And they all look pretty much at the same basic question, but they looked at it in different angles and different perspectives, with the result that their eligibility criteria ended up having anywhere between 2 to 47 studies considered eligible for inclusion. And you can understand that the conclusion based on 2 studies versus the conclusion based on 47 studies, it might be substantially different. This is just cataloging these meta-analyses, and their conclusions are different. Also, they differ based on who wrote the meta-analysis. In many cases, the meta-analyses were done by people who had a very strong interest in the results, not necessarily financial, but based on what they had published themselves in that topic in the past. So the meta-analysis came as a vindication for their team's work. How do we get rid of these problems, and how do we move forward? There's many approaches that work, and I think that environmental epidemiology has adopted many of those, and pretty successfully, and others probably there's room to adopt them. Large-scale collaboration is something that does happen in environmental epidemiology, probably more so compared to other fields in epidemiological research. Adoption of replication culture, registration of studies, protocols, analysis codes, data sets, raw data, and results. Sharing of data, protocols, materials, software, and other tools. Reproducibility practices, let's check independently what are some classics, can see whether they replicate or not. Containment of conflicted sponsors and authors, more appropriate statistical methods, standardization of definitions and analysis, more stringent thresholds for claiming discoveries or successes, improvements of study design standards, improvements in peer review, reporting and dissemination of research, and better training of the scientific workforce in methods and in statistical literacy. I will spend a little bit of time on some of these aspects that I think that there's substantial room for improvement. One area that I think that there is a lot of room for improvement is sharing of data. Some fields in epidemiology are very eager to share. For example, I think genetics is sharing a lot of data. This is a paper that we published 2.5 years ago in Science, where 71 authors, we argued that for publicly funded genomic data, they should become immediately available, even before those investigators who generated them have time to look at them. Because if they look at them, it would be for the wrong reason. The best analysis would be getting all the data together so you have the complete picture and nice power and less bias, rather than have each one of us try to look at fragments of information. Clinical trials is another field that there has been a lot of discussion about data sharing and a lot of statements about data sharing. So all the major journals ask for a data sharing statement, both for clinical trials and for other types of research. And it looks very nice because they can say, well, we have a data sharing statement, we have a plan on what will happen. But then when we looked at what do these statements say in journals like Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, and JAMA, we realize, yes, they have statements, but if you say, can I have the data now? Yes, you can apply, and maybe you will get them, maybe not. Well, can I have them now? Well, you have to wait for a year or 2 years, or we don't specify, sometime they will be available. Yes, but I want them right now. Okay, right now, 2 out of 500 trials, you can have them right now. So there is some promise or some statement, but very rarely it is delivered. Which means that there's lots of people who are paranoid, or maybe they're not paranoid, and they think that lots of the research that is circulating among us is zombies. For example, John Carlisle, the editor of Anesthesia, over the years have asked for the raw data of all the clinical research studies that come his way, clinical trials, and the authors would send the data to him, he would take a look, that was a precondition to review and publication. He concluded that about 30 to 40% of these trials were zombie trials, that the data were completely flawed, they must have been either fraudulent or completely wrong. And if you run the calculations, if his experience is not just one crazy editor out there, if it applies to medicine at large, then we have probably about 500,000 zombie randomized trials circulating among us. I wrote that editorial on a Halloween date, but I think it's probably more serious than just a joke. In situations where data sharing is not just encouraged, but it is demanded, we can have more sharing. For example, BMJ and PLOS Medicine ask for the data to be shared if someone asks for them, and we did ask for them. So 46% of the investigators showed us their data. We told them that we're going to reanalyze what they did and see whether we get the same result. We did, and we did get the same result. Very minor deviations, but practically the conclusions were the same. So we can have an environment where sharing is not just speculated, but it does happen, it is actionable, and then most of the time I think I can trust the results that I see published. How much sharing is happening is shown by that plot, which is a random sample of the biomedical literature from 2000 to 2017. We saw very little action in the early 2000s, and we see an increase that has reached about 20% by 2017. We extended that observation last year in PLOS Biology, looking at the entire millions of articles that are open access in PubMed, and we see that there's clearly some change. About 20% of biomedical papers share their data. How many of them share their code? It's less, it's about 2 to 3%. How many of them register a protocol? It's still very, very few. There's more transparency in terms of having statements for conflicts of interest and for funding. Most of the time, there's no conflicts of interest. You have to take it at face value, and maybe there's some hidden conflicts, but that's okay. At least there is some statement. And most papers continue to say that what they are showing us is something novel. Few, but an increasing share, are saying, yes, I have some replication that I'm trying to do, or both novelty and replication at the same time. This is another view of the same data. We also have maps of science. These are universes of science, and we're mapping the presence of these sharing and transparency and reproducibility practices. You see that they tend to occupy different areas within the scientific galaxy. For example, code sharing is happening in some fields that are more computationally intensive or more knowledgeable. Data sharing has some overlap with code sharing, but not necessarily much. And disclosures and protocol registration, they are their own world. Few journals do that most of the time. Most journals do that never, in terms of sharing code, data, and registering protocols, but we do see some action, and we see some journals moving in the direction of sharing. Better statistics and methods, I think, can make a difference, and I think that epidemiology, as the soul of the methodological machinery of public health, can also help promote other fields towards better statistical methods. We need the average paper to be improved, and this means better statistical training and improved literacy and numeracy of the entire scientific workforce. We need better choice of study designs. We need some standard features to be adopted more routinely. People have proposed lots of checklists. I'm not sure where they help. I mean, if someone is not well trained, can we salvage the case just by saying check a number of items? Most people will do because they want to publish their paper, but I'm not sure that they will really change the machinery of what they have done. People love p-values, and we have ended up having a boring nuisance. In text mining that we did in that JAMA paper, we saw that 96% of the biomedical literature claims statistically significant results. When there's p-values in the abstract or in the full text, everything is significant, and everything is important, and everything is novel, so it's a little bit confusing. The good news is that we have more non-significant results over time, so it has gone up from something like 2% to 5%, and maybe it will increase a little bit in the future. We'll have more failures populating the literature, like me, but who knows? Computational methods they need some extra attention because reproducibility of computational methods, especially complex computational methods, can be more tricky. It is not enough to just say, well, these are the regression coefficients and the constant, and you can tell what I did. A few years ago, we published these recommendations on how to improve reproducibility of computational methods in science. You can think of different methods having a gradient between complexity and transparency. Usually methods that are more complex tend to be less transparent, so we need to pay more attention. And even the most complex methods, they can be transparent. A couple of years ago, we published that paper in Nature where we argued that for artificial intelligence with deep neural networks, there are tools, there are structures, there are processes that can be used and can make everything very transparent and reproducible. The tools are there, the codes are there, the algorithms are there if someone wants to be transparent and reproducible. Eventually, do we need a revolution or do we need evolution? I think we need both. When we published that manifesto, it sounded a bit revolutionary, but over the years, I'm happy to see evolution. And revolution might be even better, but revolution can be tricky and you can get revolution for the wrong causes sometimes. There are lots of opportunities at the level of generating hypotheses, designing studies, conducting studies, analyzing data, interpreting results, and publishing results. They're all opportunities. There are steps where we can have bias, but also opportunities where we can introduce safety checks. And who's going to do that? It's not just one person. I think it's the entire scientific community, and not just the scientific community. It's also funders, it's journals, editors, publishers, philanthropists in medicine. It could be insurance companies, public health agencies. It could be governments. It could be states. It could be counties. It could be anyone who is involved in the process of making sense of science. Peer review is still not perfect, but of course, we have to use it. We have to use it in more constructive ways. A few days ago, we had the peer review congress in Chicago that I was one of the directors. So there's lots of ideas on how to improve it before publication, during publication, after publication. None of them is perfect, but I think can help. And the last thing that can help, and maybe that's the best solution, is to realign and re-engineer our reward system so that we get what we want. We get the best research, the best science that can also have the best translational potential and the best impact on public health, both for knowledge and for decision making. It's not just productivity. I love publishing papers. If you tell me don't publish papers, I will be depressed. I don't know. Will I commit suicide? Hopefully not, but please don't tell me that. So we love publishing papers, but we need to focus more on quality, on reproducibility, on sharing, and on translational impact, both at the clinical level and the public health level. If you run the acronym, it's an electrocardiogram, PQRST. And do we pay attention to this electrocardiogram? Not much. Along with David Moher and other colleagues, we have proposed criteria for institutions to consider for hiring, promotion, and tenure. We also did some empirical studies trying to see how often progressive criteria of sharing, quality, reproducibility, translation are used. They're not used. At least if you look at the university handbooks, they're rarely there. Although I think that many people do consider them when they judge candidates or faculty for promotion and for tenure. To conclude, science is the best thing that has happened to humans, and we need to invest more in research, especially high-quality, reproducible research. There are many possible interventions that may improve the efficiency of research practices and the reproducibility and eventually utility of the evidence. Transparency, openness, and sharing are likely to help, but details on how to can also be important. And obviously, we don't want to do harm by imposing very draconian criteria that would just make all research intolerable or too difficult to be accepted. The landscape of reproducibility is currently changing very rapidly. I think that I'm not able to predict what will happen in the next 5 years, probably not even in the next year. I think that we have great scientists, we have great ideas, and also a lot of commitment to push forward for science that matters, for science that translates into public health benefits. And I hope that you will be at the forefront of that effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ioannidis, for your speech and all the effort to come and be present with us today. So I would welcome some questions, first from our audience here. Comments?
Yes. I have the mic. Thank you for the really comprehensive and provocative, thoughtful discussion that we all need. One thing that I was hoping to see, but I'm sorry, Wael El-Delami from University of California, San Diego. Research ethics training is missing from all what you have presented. Why?
My fault. I think that education is clearly very important, and research ethics is central in that regard. The big challenge is, what exactly is research ethics? For example, is having a sound study design an ethical question? And there's a lot of debate, because traditionally ethics have been seen as falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism. These are like the trio of ethical sins. And of course, there is some fraudulent science. We do see that. But most researchers are not fraudulent. They're not that they're fabricating data. Plagiarism has almost disappeared after the advent of software that can check plagiarism. And I think that the major issue is whether other practices, for example, questionable research practices, which many people say we should not call them questionable research practices, we should call them detrimental research practices or harmful research practices. Are these ethical issues eventually? I think they are. They're both methodology and ethics. And it's interesting that we see that confluence of methodology, which is something very dear to epidemiologists, and ethics. It's a very unique confluence that we see. And I believe that people need to be trained in the sense that doing good research is an ethical mission. And of course, doing poor research, wasting money, wasting efforts, wasting your fellow's time, wasting your time, my time, anyone's time, doing the research, reading the research, interpreting the research, applying the research is a problem. It's an ethical problem. So the content for these curricula, I think, needs to be revisited so that it can be comprehensive and encompass all these aspects, and also the aspects of the reward system. What do we reward eventually in science? We want to reward this type of ethical, rigorous science, I believe.
Thank you very much, Manolis. One question, and then I will ask a couple of questions we have also from the virtual participants.
Okay. So, Yanni, thank you very much. As expected, it was a great talk, and thank you very much for making us more self-critical for our work and the work of our colleagues, and producing better research. Definitely, lots of what you have said has been very important for lots of people doing research. However, the overall message, at least as it is in a simplistic way translated many times, research doesn't work. This is how it is translated. And this is a wrong message. And I'm not saying you are saying it, but this is how it's translated. And because actually research works. We have huge improvements. We have monumental failures, especially in implementation. For example, just to talk about one of the exposures we have here on water research, you know, about 800,000 people dying from diarrhea, you know, because of not having clean water. It's a problem of implementation research and obviously of implementation, of scaling up interventions that function. But, you know, we have huge successes. You know, vaccination, HPV, you know, COVID vaccine with all the problems, you know, and advances in therapies, advances in understanding causes of disease. So, okay, 50% of the Nature Science papers were wrong, but the other 50 were right. And 30% of the... So it is this aspect that really has to come in front because, and I'm not saying you're saying it, but this type of message is very easy to be translated into a wrong message outside on people who doubt science. And I'm really skeptical about how some of the, what you are saying, which are really, I agree, but they are really not used correctly. And this is a problem for science.
I share your concerns. I think that reproducibility as a theme can be weaponized. So it can be used by people who might want to say that, oh, so science is horrible and it's all wrong and, you know, I will believe in my ideology or whatever, or in something that is anti-scientific or non-scientific. So this is a problem. I'm not saying it is not. The question is, how do you deal with anti-science or with efforts to diminish the importance of science? I'm very worried that trying to paint a picture of science as being perfect or, you know, being error-free or being always a success or being mostly successful is actually giving more ammunition to these narratives, because they will always be able to come up with some minor glitch, you know, sometimes more than just a minor glitch in some of the literature. And then they will say, I told you, here it is, and now you can dismiss the rest. It's a big problem. I don't have a perfect answer. I'm struggling myself on what is the right message, but I think that really presenting science with the scientific method, which includes replication, reproducibility, critical thinking, healthy skepticism, that questioning spirit of trying to get things more accurate and better, is probably the best recipe compared to a communication approach where we try to say, we're very successful. We are successful, but I think we gain more points when we say, we're struggling, we're working very hard. We have so many people who are working day and night, you know, working very hard with very difficult odds. And we can get it wrong, yes, but look at that, we can also get it right, and eventually we get it right. So it's an issue of communication. There's a whole science of science communication at the moment. We need more evidence. There's few randomized trials on this, like communication messages, especially for different communities. I think that it depends also who you're talking to. Are you talking to other scientists or talking to a general public or some public that is infused with some other type of messages? It's a very, very complex question, and I don't think that we have an easy answer. But my bias is to try to present science for what it is, with its pluses and minuses, and with the scientific method at the core.
Thank you very much, because we are running out of time and we have other keynote lectures. Just one comment to the two questions that are online. Any recommendations for improving data quality evaluation in a systematic review of EP studies? So data quality evaluation is the one, and your opinion on causal methods.
On what methods?
Causal epidemiology.
Okay, and
causal inference methods in particular, if they are part of the solution or the problem itself, or what? Just one note to conclude. Thank you.
I love causal methods, and, you know, thinking about causal methods and implementing them, especially in difficult epidemiological questions. I think that they improve our way of thinking and our way of preemptively considering possibilities. I don't think that they're bulletproof. They're not like the perfect guidance. And of course, there's many variants on how to use them and also on how to misuse them sometimes. But I like people who think more. That's my bias, to not like just saying, oh, I will just run the analysis and then I will see what comes out. people who think a lot ahead of time, I think they save themselves a lot of trouble, a lot of embarrassment, a lot of difficulties that arise downstream when the results look perfect, let alone they don't look perfect. In most epidemiology, they don't look perfect. Now, the first question was on systematic reviews and on
recommendation for improving data quality evaluation.
data on
Quality.
data quality evaluation. Goodness, yes. There's many recommendations on both appraising single studies of different types of epidemiology, of interventions in observational settings, of interventions in randomized, of meta-analysis themselves, of course, and of all sorts of studies. There's also many reporting guidelines for all sorts of studies. There's more than 400 reporting guidelines. There's tools for appraising systematic reviews and umbrella reviews of systematic reviews. So it's an industry at the moment that is blossoming at a very fast pace. Many of these tools are pretty well validated, others less so. Most of them, I think, are not necessarily applied in a rigorous way. So I have seen many papers that say that we use that tool, but then you look at the data and they're nowhere close to what is really happening. I think we need more education, again, on how to use them. Maybe we need a bit less, but better quality in order to make sense.
So thank you again. Thank you all for being here. And
thank you very much.
Let me offer you a thank you note and gift.